I'm thrilled to be here on John F. Kennedy Street in what I think I'll think of from now on as Howard Zinn's town, and I want to talk. I want to talk about something that comes up rather late in the book, I think, namely the United States Senate, because of a couple of things that happened in that godforsaken place yesterday. And, you know, the Senate comes in for a little criticism in my book, where I argue essentially for putting it out of its misery. I think we could do quite well without it. No, we couldn't throw in the House too, because then we would have nothing left. In fact, I argue for expanding the House, which is long overdue for expansion, not to mention numerous reforms to make it actually representative of us. But the Senate was created to be anti-democratic. The Senate was created to be a weight against majority rule in this country, and it has been. The Senate maintained slavery. The Senate arguably took us into a civil war. The Senate blocked essential basic rights for African Americans and others for years. On every issue that you look at, now and in the past, it's always a question of the House having to make the legislation bad enough to get it through the Senate. Right? Now, so in each case, you can imagine passing better legislation if you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to get it through the Senate. The Senate is disproportionate in how it's set up, right? It represents equally states that have 17 million people and states that have 250,000 people, right? The result of this is that places like North Dakota, for every dollar they put in taxes, get back over $2 in services. Massachusetts, it's the other direction, right? The large states are supporting the small states where the need is less, but the funding is greater, because of how the Senate is established. And this is not to say that the argument for this is that the Senate represents the interests of small states, which otherwise would not be well represented. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. The Senate is where legislation is always pushed forward that strips all states of rights and consolidates more power in Washington. And the Senate does not represent the people of small states any better than the people of large states, except to the very limited extent to which they are more tolerant of wars and Wall Street bailouts and corporate control and corruption, which is very little. So two things that happened in this place that is still with us yesterday. The first, I think, is a case in point for how the Senate is a problem. A guy named Jim Bunning, who's a senator from Kentucky, was extremely upset and outraged. He's very, very concerned that we be wise in how we spend our money. So every time we throw $100 billion or $1 trillion more into a pointless illegal war or military boondoggle, that's our patriotic duty. He has no concerns whatsoever. But here comes $10 billion for unemployment insurance. People who are out of work need to survive, and he's outraged. How can we spend $10 billion, this drop in the bucket of what we waste on wars and now on Wall Street, without knowing exactly where it's going to come from? This is irresponsible. So he stands up alone to block this legislation. The interesting thing, I think, about where he and the rest of these people are willing to put the money, namely into military and into wars, is that causes the unemployment, right? And the University of Massachusetts at Amherst has done the best research of anywhere on this. That is that no matter, you can't come up with anything that the government could do with our money that would produce fewer jobs than putting it into the military and wars, right? And that's even just domestically into military bases and weapons making here, much less foreign wars. Even the right-wing scheme of cutting more taxes for rich people produces more jobs than dumping the money into the military and wars. Not nearly as many as putting the money into useful, nonviolent things like education and infrastructure and green energy. But still, so we dump all the money into what creates the unemployment, and then we're outraged that we might have to spend a little on supporting people who are unemployed. And to frame how this works and where Mr. Bunning was coming from with his maneuver, in the Senate, you have 100 senators. You could have 51 pass a bill and represent 17% of Americans. That's the extreme. You take the 51 from the smallest states. But you can have 41 representing 11% of Americans stop any bill. And when it comes to passing constitutional amendments or ratifying treaties, you could have senators representing 7% of us block anything, right? So there's a problem of majority rule even within this anti-democratic institution. The reason that I say 41, of course, is the filibuster, right? Now, who remembers where in the Constitution the filibuster comes up? It's not in there. It's not in there. It's not in the Bible. We got along very fine for many decades without it, right? It was sort of created by accident, and then they had to deal with it. And in 1917, they made a rule. The Senate can make rules. A majority of senators can make rules. No elaborate supermajorities needed. Just a majority of the Senate making rules for itself. In 1917, they made a rule that said, yeah, if you get 2/3 of the senators who are there in the room voting, you can cut off the filibuster, end the debate, and get to the actual vote on the issue and vote on it. They changed it in 1949. They said, well, we're going to make it 2/3 of all senators. 1959, they changed it back to the way it was. 1975, not that long ago, 1975, they changed it to say 3/5 of all the Senate, right? And they changed that with a simple majority, right? They didn't have to get. They didn't have to pass a bill. They didn't have to get 2/3 or 3/4 or anything more than a simple majority to change it. There's now a bill, Senator Harkin and some other senators have put in a bill to reform this filibuster rule. Raise your hand if you can spot the problem with that maneuver.
Well, I have a question, which is, does it take is it a simple majority, or does it require 3/5?
Well, you get to the point. It can be filibustered. The bill to fix the filibuster can be filibustered, right? It's a game. It's a charade. It's like most bills, like 99% of bills, it's put in to make a statement and say something and look good and go home and brag about it. It's playing around. The filibuster, by the way, is the most dearly beloved excuse of Democrats in Washington, right? Imagine if they didn't have the filibuster. You look at progressive media outlets, you look at blogs, you look at leftist groups and peace and justice activism and Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann, and 80-90% of it is talking about the Republicans and the teabaggers as if they were relevant to anything, as if we weren't out ahead and had already voted them completely out of power, right? If it were not for the filibuster, right, some people would have to recognize that, hey, we voted the Democrats into complete control of everything in Washington. They're choosing not to do anything with that power. Is there a problem here? Is there a reason why they can't stop talking about how the Republicans are worse, even though we already voted them out? So, the filibuster is there because they want it there. And yet, there are moves to get rid of it that may or may not be serious, and we may or may not be able to make it happen. But the proposal from some people, as long as it's there, is, well, make them do it. Make them stand up and talk all night, right? Because people still imagine that that's what a filibuster is. And people think of a filibuster as defending the small voices of the minority, even though that means a handful of millionaire elderly white guys in Washington who misrepresent almost all of us. And so there was a proposal yesterday to make this guy stand up all night and talk. Here you have a senator from Kentucky where there are plenty of people unemployed who need unemployment insurance, and he wants to stand up and talk and oppose letting them have the money. And Senator Durbin and the Democrats said, well, we'll make him do it. We'll wear him out. And they started to wear him out. You know, I mean, he was staggering. He was cursing at people on the floor of the Senate. Little seen since Vice President Cheney moved on in his career. And in the end, the Democrats decided it was more important to not hurt the feelings of this poor elderly gentleman from Kentucky and let him go home and have a good night's sleep than to get anybody unemployment insurance. So they caved. And presumably they think that it will actually be good for them that people will blame this guy, Senator Bunning, for opposing unemployment insurance. But people will blame the Democrats for being in power and not getting anything done, including unemployment insurance, and rightly so. There's no debate that they can just change this rule. There's also no debate that they can push bills through with this reconciliation procedure and get around the rule, but they can change the rule. The only debate is whether they can do it right now or they have to wait till the start of a new session, right? And Senator from New Mexico, Tom Udall, has committed to raising a point of order and getting a vote to change the rule at the start of the next session, right? And we have Senate candidates like Jonathan Tassini, a friend of mine who's running in New York, all the Senate candidates in North Carolina now, one following the other, and now Senator Durbin yesterday. At the same time that he caves in on an actual filibuster, he too, following these challengers, puts a petition on his website to end the filibuster. Whether this is pure hypocrisy or serious, and we can force them to do it at the start of the next session, remains to be seen. But I think we ought to build that pressure. We ought to get commitments from every senator we can, from any party, and this is open to senators from either party, arguably, to be willing to end the filibuster rule at the start of the next session and get on top of them on day one and raise hell if they don't do it, because there's no excuse for something this anti-democratic.